Hello, good evening in the UK. Good morning, Mexico and the US, and you're all very welcome wherever you may be. It is my great pleasure to be with you here today. My name is Elena Gonzalez, and I am the director of the Center for Mexican Studies of the National Autonomous University of Mexico in the United Kingdom. And one of our missions is to divulge Mexican culture. And on this occasion, it is with great joy that we are having this pair of talks about Elena Garro and her very, very celebrated novel, The Recollection of Things to Come. It is through a very welcome and fascinating initiative from Montse Redondo, who you shall meet in a moment, who from the Westminster Library suggested that we hold this event. And we are very, very happy to finally have made it come true with the participation of two exceptional academics that we shall meet eventually. For now, from the Center for Mexican Studies, I wish you welcome. And it's over to you, Montse. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much, Ana Elena. And thank you, Olivia and Patricia. Beforehand, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. My name is Montserrat Redondo. I work as a library officer for Westminster Libraries. I am based at Victoria Library, where now we have a couple of the copies of the complete biography of Elena Garro donated by Patricia Rosas. They are already in our collection, but I find very difficult to put them away on the shelves. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Olivia Vázquez Medina. Olivia Vázquez Medina has collaborated with Westminster and with UNAM in several occasions. For Westminster with the unforgettable event of Juan Rulfo. Thank you for that, Olivia. And well, I'm going to introduce you. She was born in San Luis Potosí, Mexico, is associated professor in Spanish at the University of Oxford. She has published a widely number of Mexican and Spanish American literature studies from the 20th century and the 21st century, including the monograph Cuerpo, Historia y Textualidad en Augusto Roa Bastos, Fernando del Paso y Gabriel García Márquez. Her current research focuses on prose fiction by contemporary Spanish American women writers, including Samantha Schweblin, Cristina Rivera Garza, Mariana Enriquez, y Fernanda Trias and Giovanna Rivero. So welcome, and the floor is yours, Olivia.
Thank you, Montse. Thank you so much to you and to Ana Elena. And it is a great pleasure to be here. I am opening the session. This is going to be, I think Patricia and I have decided to divide the content of the session in ways that you're going to see today. What I wanted to do to start was I assume that some of you might not have read the novel because we're opening this up to a general audience, to a general public. And I wanted to start by giving you a taster of the book by showing you some passages and commenting on them, and to slowly take you into the world that Elena Garro creates. The main thing to tell you at this stage, if you haven't read the novel, is that the novel is concerned with a town called Ixtepec and two particularly dramatic episodes that take part in this town under the occupation of the forces of a general called Francisco Rosas in the 1920s in Mexico, which is where the novel is set. So I'm going to share my screen to start with. I hope this works. Should do. Can you see the screen here?
Yes, it's fine,
yeah.
Olivia.
Thank you. We are here then to celebrate Elena Garro's book, Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, which was published in 1963. And as I said, Patricia will cover quite a few aspects of the life of Elena Garro and also aspects of the novel itself. And I wanted to start then by saying that we will hear later how the novel is concerned with a period in Mexican history, but it is also a captivating story. Some of that, the reason for it to be a captivating story are the plots, the themes, the characters, the situations. But what makes the novel unique is the way in which it is written. And it is this aspect that I wanted to start with by sharing it with you. The story is full of suspense and lyricism. And one thing that stands out for me is also the atmosphere and the sense of place that emerge from the novel. So in this short intervention, I want to say a few words about Garro's wonderful style, her use of language, her use of imagery, her use of narrative voice, and I will comment on the many imaginative possibilities that this style opens up. Patricia, as I said, will talk more about Elena Garro's life, as well as the plot, the themes, and the characters. But what I wanted to do was to start by giving you a taster of what the novel reads like, in case you haven't read it. I'll also say a couple of things at the end about why I think this novel is actual, why it speaks to us right now, 60 years after its publication. So in order to start, I wanted to start by the beginning, which is the opening of the novel, which is there are some unforgettable lines in the novel in the way it opens. I'm going to be reading from, quoting from Spanish, but I've also included the English translation, which is from the published translation by Ruth Sims. So let's read just the opening of Los Recuerdos del Porvenir. Aquí estoy sentado sobre esta piedra aparente. Solo mi memoria sabe lo que encierra. La veo y me recuerdo. Y como el agua va al agua, así yo, melancólico, vengo a encontrarme en su imagen cubierta por el polvo, rodeada por las hierbas, encerrada en sí misma y condenada a la memoria y a su variado espejo. La veo y me transfiguro en multitud de colores y de tiempos. Estoy y estuve en muchos ojos. Yo solo soy memoria y la memoria que de mí se tenga. Desde esta altura me contemplo, grande, tendido en un valle seco. Me rodean unas montañas espinosas y unas llanuras amarillas pobladas de coyotes. You might have noticed the rhythm that is almost like an incantation. There is something enigmatic about these words and about the jaw, the eye that utters them. Who speaks here? This is our first question when we start reading the novel. The Spanish sentado might make us think that this is a male narrator, and obviously we might think this is a human male narrator. But as we progressively discover, things are not so simple in this novel. From the outset, Garro introduces an innovation in terms of narrative technique. The narrator of Recollections of Things to Come is neither a human character, but nor a disembodied voice external to the story, like a conventional omniscient narrator. The narrator is Ixtepec, it's the town itself, with its houses, its inhabitants, its fields, its geology and rocks, insects, plants, and climate. And it is also the collective feelings, memories, and desires of its people. So despite speaking in the first person, the narrator is not one person, but a combination of human and non-human beings. This extraordinary creation, this unusual narrator, will guide us, will guide the reader through the story. And of course, that means that the story is therefore not told from a conventional point of view. We as readers are presented with this narrator that is only memory, solo soy memoria, a narrator that is time, and therefore contains the past and the future into its material existence, as we read in these few lines. From this first paragraph, we realize that there's going to be a deeply unconventional sense of time reading, guiding the novel. I think later on we'll hear more from Patricia about ideas of time in the novel, but I wanted to start by highlighting the oxymoron or the apparent impossibility in the very title, Los recuerdos del porvenir, or recollections of things to come. This notion sends us both to the past and to the future at the same time. Some of you might have read Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, which was published 4 years after Garro's novel. And in 100 Years of Solitude, if you might remember, from the very first line, again, we are pushed to the past and to the future at the same time. So in Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, time will follow unusual patterns, but it is not only time, it is also the point of view that dominates the novel that is going to be unusual in the sense of not belonging to one human character. In terms of the memory and the town being memory, we have this notion that memory is material. The past exists physically in the present, and therefore the past is here. The past is always there to question the present. The use of such an unconventional narrator also goes hand in hand with the style of the novel, which weaves an aura of mystery into the depiction of reality. And I wanted to show you a couple of examples about this. So the novel is divided in two halves, and they're very, very different from each other. And the first example that I wanted to discuss comes from the first half. It focuses on the house of the Moncada family, of whom I think we will hear more later, and on one of its members, a young woman called Isabel, who is one of the protagonists. So let's have a look at this example. Let me just try and close some of the, yeah, it's probably clear. La noche se deslizaba sin cesar por la puerta abierta del jardín. En la habitación se instalaron insectos y perfumes oscuros. Un misterioso río fluía implacable y comunicaba el comedor de los Moncada con el corazón de las estrellas más remotas. Durante unos segundos la casa entera viajó por los cielos, se integró en la Vía Láctea y luego cayó sin ruido en el mismo punto en el que se encuentra ahora. Isabel recibió el choque de la caída, saltó de su asiento, miró a sus hermanos y se sintió segura. Notice how things get more and more unusual and intriguing and extraordinary as the passage progresses. The first statement, la noche se deslizaba, or the night slid, could simply be understood as a way of speaking. Then notice the strong presence of the physical world. We can imagine the insects, perhaps their sounds or the sensations that they have been moving across the room until they settle. And then the words referring to scent, which allows us to recreate in our own embodied imagination what a dark scent might mean to each one of us. Then notice how a deep sense of mystery emerges from what has so far appeared to be an entirely realist setting. We could read this reference to a mysterious river figuratively as a metaphor. It is a beautiful image that opens the scope of the scene. But I think it's interesting to notice as well that the scale of reality has expanded. We have moved from the reference to insects, which are normally tiny, to the estrellas más remotas, to the stars, and then to the sky, to the Milky Way, to the Vía Láctea. I said that up to when we had a mysterious river, we could have read this metaphorically, but then something else altogether is happening in the last two sentences. In these two sentences, we have a detailed description of an event that does not fit into a realist understanding of the world. The realm of the extraordinary erupts into the narrative, and we are told that the whole house zoomed through the sky. And we are also told the physical sensations that might arise from such an event. Notice the interesting choice of the present tense in the use of now, where the house is now, the space that the house now occupies, we wonder, when is this now? Is this when the scene is unfolding, or is it happening from that present from which Ixtepec, the town, tells the story? Notice how interesting it is to mention the absence of a noise, because mentioning the absence immediately leads us to imagine what the noise would be, arising from the resounding commotion that be produced from this situation of a house zooming through the sky and then falling back into its place. The final sentence suggests that all this is perceived by Isabel, which might lead us to wonder whether such a magical occurrence, and I'm using the word magical with care here, carefully here, such a magical occurrence has objectively taken place, or whether it is simply a description of this character's thoughts or imagination. Although we can argue that there is ambiguity here, in my view, the narrative is definitely suggesting this expansion of the possibilities of reality. That is the signature trait of the literary mode that we call magical realism. One way to understand magical realism is precisely this. Reality is made bigger to include events and occurrences that, from a conventional, rational logic, we would consider impossible. It is interesting to notice as well how Isabel is unfazed by the event. We are told that she simply notices the collision but does not find it surprising. Again, a trait that we associate with magical realism. Having said that, I would not want in any way to classify, to put a tag on this novel, whether magical realism or anything else, because Recollections of Things to Come is actually a beautifully multi-layered text. For me, two of its most striking characteristics are the descriptions of the non-human world or the natural world, and the use of poetic and figurative language. And I will take the next few minutes to talk about this, which has already emerged in what I've said so far. Let's have a look at a further example. Un calor ardiente flotaba en el jardín. Los helechos crecían desmesurados entre las sombras y las formas obtusas de las montañas que me rodean se instalaron en el cielo por encima de los tejados y oprimieron a la noche. Tomás Segovia se esforzó por ensartar frases brillantes como cuentas, pero ante el silencio de sus amigos perdió el hilo y las vio rodar melancólico por el suelo y perderse entre las patas de las sillas. In the first half of this example, we perceive a wonderful vitality and vibrancy in the plants, the weather, and the mountains, what I'm calling the non-human here. Throughout Recollections of Things to Come, the non-human world has a strong presence. There is a sense that nature vibrates with this extraordinary vitality. To some extent, this connects Garro's novel with a tradition of Latin American literature called the novela de la tierra, to some extent, but it also has other consequences that I will discuss in a few minutes. The second part of this quotation, referring to Tomás Segovia, who is a character who attempts to do poetry, is an example, gives you an example of Garro's beautiful use of figurative language. And here she is employing a simile or comparison that captures the disillusionment felt by the character in an image where both immaterial words and Tomás's feelings are expressed in the tangible image of the beads rolling on the floor. We can almost hear them, the beads, sprawling through the floor. Both of these elements, the presence of nature, of the non-human world, and the use of poetic style are, for me, as I said, the standout characteristic of the novel, and they are present throughout. And I would love to have a lot of time to almost read the novel here and comment it all with you, but I don't have all that time. So I will just mention a couple of other examples where I find Garro's style really striking. This refers to the date of a party that is going to be a fateful event in the destiny of the town and in terms of the plot. And just notice how the idea of a much expected date arriving, how this is described. La fecha esperada por todos se abrió paso entre los días y llegó redonda y perfecta como una naranja. Como ese hermoso fruto permanece en mi memoria iluminando las tinieblas que vinieron después. Las horas cayeron translúcidas en la superficie de ese día, abrieron un círculo y se precipitaron en la casa de Carmen B. de Arrieta. Rodeado de ondas luminosas, los ojos ávidos y el cuerpo alerta, Ixtepec esperaba el instante de la fiesta. La casa hechizada esperaba con nosotros. I think this passage condenses beautifully Garro's poetic style and the expressive possibilities given by a non-personal narrator. I can't help but include other examples, and I will mention it in a moment. But the narrative is really pushing our imagination to visualize and to recreate things from a non-conventional point of view. I mentioned this other example which I wanted to comment as well. This one focuses on a description of the garden. And so let's read it together. Un vapor se levantaba del jardín. Las plantas despedían olores húmedos y penetrantes. Las grandes hojas carnosas con los tallos de agua se mantenían erguidas a pesar de la violencia del calor. Los macizos de plátanos se llenaban de rumores extraños. La tierra era negra y húmeda. La fuente lucía su agua verdosa y en su superficie flotaban aguas en descomposición y enormes mariposas ahogadas. De ahí también surgía un olor descompuesto y pantanoso. El jardín que en la noche era luminoso y negro, cubierto de hojas misteriosas. Sorry, I didn't include that. I'm going to cut it there. And en el jardín los insectos se destruían unos a otros en esa lucha invisible y activa que llena a la tierra de rumores. So we have colors, textures, sensations, pungent smells, rumors, and noises emerging from the plants and insects. Therefore carrying on that non-conventional perspective on the world in a way that is enigmatic and mysterious. Such a strong presence of what we can call the natural world is, however, not independent from the historical and political dimension addressed by the novel. It is not as if all of these plants and insects and rocks existed independently from what is happening in terms of the historical forces and how they are and the conflict that is unfolding in the town. And I think this is really crucial because Recollections of Things to Come interweaves very successfully these different scales. And with the word scale, I mean both in terms of time and in terms of size. So we talked about insects and plants, but we can also talk about valleys and the Milky Way. And, you know, and the novel takes us from the tiny to the immense, but also in terms of time. There is a sense of human time, historical time, individual time, but also a time of nature, a time of the non-human. And all of these are going to be interwoven together. I wanted to comment just one further example. It's a little bit long, but it illustrates precisely this point that I'm trying to make. Un canto de chicharras inundaba el valle, se levantaba en las bardas, aparecía cerca de las fuentes inmóviles. Las chicharras eran las únicas que agradecían al sol que llegara a la mitad del cielo. Nadie miraba las lagartijas tornasoles. Todo mi esplendor caía en la ignorancia, en un no querer mirarme, en un olvido voluntario. Y mientras tanto, mi belleza ilusoria y cambiante se consumía y renacía como una salamandra. En vano cruzaban los jardines nubes de mariposas amarillas. Nadie agradecía sus apariciones repentinas. La sombra de Francisco Rosas cubría mis cielos, empañaba el brillo de mis tardes, ocupaba mis esquinas y se introducía en las conversaciones. Notice this wonderful emphasis on the tiny scale of the cicadas, on the lizards and butterflies, interestingly, yellow butterflies. whilst at the same time talking about the sky and the sunsets and gardens. But moreover, all of this is oppressed by the historical political situation and suggests that the timescales of the natural world and those of human history are woven together. The oppressiveness of Rosas's regime is made to be felt physically in all aspects of people's lives, including the sky, including los cielos, el brillo de las tardes, the corners and conversations. Again, this wonderful elasticity in terms of moving through different scales. So a couple of quick ideas to finish off my contribution. First of all, Los Recuerdos del Porvenir is perhaps not as well known outside Mexico as other Latin American novels from the 1960s. And I believe that Patricia will share some ideas as to why that might be the case. But I think we can certainly place it alongside other works of Spanish American fiction from around the mid-20th century that explore these connections, these interconnections between a material place, a geography and a landscape, and notions of myth or magic, and notions of cultural and historical specificity. Works of prose fiction that became associated with the literary mode that we now call magical realism. And I wanted to just mention some precursors from 1949, Miguel Ángel Asturias and Carpentier. Asturias was Guatemalan, Carpentier was Cuban. And then we have the wonderful novel by Juan Rulfo, Pedro Páramo, which I'm very far from suggesting is an example of magical realism. Actually, in no way am I suggesting that these novels are comparable or that they are doing the same thing at all. But I do notice, I do see some links in the exploration of connections between material place or setting, myth or magic, and cultural specificity and certain historical processes in employing literary modes that push against realism. Again, I don't consider at all Pedro Páramo an example of magical realism. It's a completely separate beast altogether. We can talk more about it in the Q&A. That said, for me, it is even more interesting to read Recollections of Things to come from the point of view of more contemporary concerns or concerns now. On the one hand, to me, the novel feels more actual than other novels of the so-called Latin American boom of the 1960s in terms of its gender politics. And maybe we can talk more about this later. But there's another way in which Los Recuerdos del Porvenir seems strikingly current, which has to do with some of the aspects that I have noticed in this presentation. And here I am inspired by Mexican writer and thinker Cristina Rivera Garza, in particular in her book Escrituras Geológicas. As Rivera Garza suggests, our present era, defined by climate change and ecological disaster, compels us to look at place and territory not as neutral or natural settings, but as places, are zones that are marked by dynamics of exploitation and as zones of disputed resources. In this context, we no longer see the human as an essentialist category or as the center of the universe, or even as an independent entity from the environment. Situations like pollution and toxicity, but also, for example, the pandemic, have brought home to us how deeply interconnected we are to other humans, but also other species, plants, air, water, geological formations. Now, this might seem quite far away from Garro's novel, but I hope what I've said today about her choice of a non-dominant, non-personal type of narrator in a way that centers the human as the founding source of narrative in a novel, as well as the way in which matter and the non-human are interwoven with human history. I hope these two things kind of serve as an illustration of the novel's great actuality and prescience, and why it is also interesting to read it today. So thank you. That's all I had prepared, but we can talk more in the Q&A if you want. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Olivia, for that insight. It was really wonderful. And thank you for your collaboration and for your passionate knowledge. And for the book you've recommended, Elena Garro. Yeah, I just have a quick look, and it looks very interesting. So now I'm gonna introduce Patricia Rosas-Lopategui. Thank you, Patricia, for being here with us. When I contacted you to take part in these events, I couldn't believe that you say yes. So I'm really, really, really grateful. So what can be said about Patricia Rosas-Lopategui? You were born in Tuxpan, Veracruz, and you are an associated professor at the Chicana and Chicano Studies Department of the University of New Mexico, now in the United States, although it should be in Mexico, right? And you have published a biography of Elena Garro in 3 volumes. The first one, Yo solo soy memoria, biografía visual de Elena Garro. The second one, Testimonios sobre Elena Garro, biografía exclusiva y autorizada de Elena Garro. And the third one, El asesinato de Elena, periodismo a través de una perspectiva biográfica, in 2 editions. Sorry, I don't have the English translations for these titles. You are the first to compile Elena Garro's plays, and you coordinated and contributed to the introduction of the Obras Unidas 2, Teatro, and her unpublished poetry in Cristales del Tiempo. Your most recent work on Elena Garro consists in 2 volumes, Diálogos con Elena Garro, Entrevistas y otros textos, which is added to other publications. Your interest is recognizing the innovations of 10 Mexican writers of the 20th century led you to create the Insurrectas series. So, Patricia, we are all waiting for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Olivia, for such a wonderful presentation about Elena Garro's novel. And I think your excellent introduction to this novel, because it's so complex, is going to follow very well with what I prepared for all of you today. Thank you. And well, hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. I will be addressing Elena Garro's life and one of her most important works, Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, or Recollections of Things to Come. First, I wish to thank Monse Redondo, a library officer for Westminster Libraries, and Ana Elena González Treviño, director of the Center for Mexican Studies at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, United Kingdom, for inviting all of us to celebrate the 60th anniversary of Recollections of Things to Come. Let us talk about the life of one of the most fascinating women writers, political activists, and intellectuals of Mexican culture from the 20th century. Those who have read her poetry, plays, short stories, and novels believe her work is a fundamental part of contemporary literature. Our story begins during the Mexican Revolution, when Elena was born in the city of Puebla on December 11th, 1916. Her father was José Antonio Garro Melendreras, a Spaniard from Asturias, while her mother, Esperanza Navarro Benitez from Chihuahua, Mexico, was also of Spanish blood. Together, they raised 4 children. Elena spent the first 6 to 7 years of her life living in Mexico City, after which her family moved to a little village in southern Mexico called Iguala, in the state of Guerrero. Elena grew up where no real school was available to attend, so she was homeschooled and received 2 educations at the same time. A tutelage from her parents comprised of classical Western teachings and a very ethnic upbringing by her indigenous nannies and servants that worked for her family. These caretakers will not only keep the Garro Navarro household running, but also helped raise Elena. They became a loving and caring part of her family, who told her their wondrous cultural stories filled with magical entities and mythological creatures. These indigenous stories had moral and ethical guidelines, such as women who misbehaved will be turned to stone, and if someone lied, their tongue will be transformed into a rabbit's tongue, so talking wasn't possible. In contrast, in their view, good, noble, and creative people were rewarded with magical powers, such as, quote, caminar bajo la lluvia sin mojarse, end quote, which means to be able to walk in rain without getting wet. The unnatural elements in these stories are known as magical realism. When the indigenous people could not explain something with rational thought, they would use their alternative Mesoamerican cosmovision, or essentially worldview, to resolve it with fantastical elements that have their own logic. These miraculous stories will transform Elena's perception of the real world. When Elena wasn't hearing these magical tales, she instead obtained a classical Western education in the library of her father, Jose Antonio Garro, who was a liberal, cultured man and very progressive for his time. Both he and his brother Bonnie lived in Iguala and served as instructors for their children, because the war from the revolution in the village made many things from schools to electricity virtually non-existent. Her uncle Bonnie thought it was totally normal that while Elena played, he will read from Western readings, such as the verse of the Spanish poet Jorge Manrique, quote, nuestras vidas son los ríos que van a dar en la mar, que es el morir. Our lives are the rivers that travel to the ocean, that is death. End quote. Besides learning about Jorge Manrique's poetry, Elena will also read and learn the works of other Spanish classical authors, such as Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, Lope de Vega, Calderón de la Barca, as well as the Greek, Latin, English, and German writers like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Cicero, Virgil, Shakespeare, Novalis, and Hölderlin, among many others. One of her favorite classics during her childhood was the Iliad by the epic poet Homer, which I am sure many of you have also read. Her mother, Esperanza Navarro, was not a typical mother of that era. Her passion in life was reading, and just like Elena's father, Esperanza read all the Occidental classics with one of her favorites being the epic poem Paradise Lost by the English poet John Milton.
Excuse me, sorry, Patty. Were you going to share a presentation or not yet?
No,
Not yet?
Not yet.
Okay, okay. I just wanted to make sure. Sorry for the interruption.
No, no problem, no problem. Okay, so let me just
John Milton. It was about John Milton.
John Milton. Yes.
Thank you.
It's okay. It's okay, no problem. This became a psychological foundation for Elena's identity. She would later say in her interviews that her mother was always reading instead of cooking and cleaning, things she hated. To Elena, her mother became a role model of how to focus on studying above all else. The relationship between Elena, her mother and father, were based on a world of books, not traditional roles. Therefore, Elena learned the function of the family was to respect and support the intellectual and emotional development of everyone. Immersed in these dual dimensions of indigenous and European culture, Elena Garro's identity was born. During her childhood, when she wasn't studying, Elena dreamt of being a Mexican general, but she knew she would never be one because she was a Gachupina, which means people with Spanish blood. Later, Elena will discover that in Mexico, despite being born a Mexican, she was still the daughter of Spaniards, and that fact automatically made her into a Gachupina, a foreigner, or an outcast. After the Mexican Revolution that took place from 1910 to 1920, Elena faced contradictions from the Mexican post-revolutionary society in which she lived. We see this metaphorically illustrated in one of Elena's anecdotes. Quote, "On the day of El Grito, which means the declaration of Mexican Independence Day from the Spanish Empire, in a southern village, my brother and my cousin Bonnie Jr. were invited to be pages to the Queen and her princesses during the patriotic festival because they were very handsome. That was the only time that my family was honored by being positioned on the stage in the middle of military revolutionaries. My older sister Deva and I snuck away from the stage and we mixed in with the crowd. Since we were so small, all we saw above us was a ceiling of sombreros or hats. Soon we heard the grito, or the shout from the revolutionary generals. Viva Mexico! Long live Mexico! Viva! Long live! Chorused the crowd. The generals would then say, Mueran los gachupines! Death to the gachupines! Mueran! Death! The crowd answered. My sister and I fled behind closed doors to our home, waiting for the return of our indigenous extended family, since we believed our parents would never return. They returned, furious, and told us, you have ruined the grito. Where were you? The military, the Queen, and the entire plaza were all involved in the search for you. You are impossible. End quote. The patriotic celebrations of the independence of Mexico from the Spanish crown are proudly celebrated on September 15 and 16 of every year. They supposedly represent the vindication of the forgotten indigenous people who for 3 centuries were dominated by the Iberians. Elena reveals the double standard of the status quo, because the Spaniards, descendants of Mexico, were currently running the Mexican government. And at the same time, they were condemned to death by the crowd. These contradictions in Elena's childhood were vital to her perception of Mexico, and she relived these contradictions for the rest of her life. In the story Las Cuatro Moscas, or the Four Flies, Elena Garro presents one of the most dramatic and humanistic parts of her life, based on her internal conflict of being a Gachupina in the land of indigenous people. Elena appears as Lelinka in this short story. One day, Lelinka visits a soap store in town, owned by an indigenous man named Don Tomas. And Lelinka sees a beautiful doll. Quoting the story. Stammering, Lelinka says, I want that doll. Don Tomas swelled with anger. His skin turned to the color of an eggplant. He stood up and looked at her in shock. That doll is mine. Why do you want it? I like it. I like it a lot, and I want to take it home, she demanded. Don Tomas licked his thick lips, and he became an even darker eggplant purple. That's how the Gachupines are. They want to take everything home. Well, that's not going to happen. It's mine. I just like looking at it, and it costs me a lot of money. End quote. In this dialogue, Elena Garro shows that Lelinka is very pretentious by commanding Don Tomas to give her the doll, demonstrating she's also very arrogant and entitled. This is because she has the blood of a Spaniard, which is linked all the way back to the conquest of Mexico by the Spanish Empire. These conquistadores or conquerors believed they were superior to all the native people that they found in America. So this tradition continued in their descendants, such as Lelinka. Therefore, Lelinka thinks she can order around the indigenous people of her village without repercussions. Don Tomas reacts to her very differently than he normally would have before the Mexican Revolution. Garro's short story takes place after the war that was fought mainly by the campesinos or the peasants, guided by Generals Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. Whereas before the revolution, Lelinka was in total control with her Gachupina power, making the indigenous like Don Tomas inferior to her. But now, after the war, the tables have turned, and Lelinka is seen as an outcast, while Don Tomas feels empowered and is able to stand up to her. Lelinka perceives this reality after her confrontation with Don Tomas, saying, quote, "It was a sorry state to be a Gachupina. If I wasn't, Don Tomas would have given me the doll," end quote. When Lelinka returns home, her father noticed her sadness. Quote, "What happened? You look worried," asked her father, who did not talk to her like Don Tomas. Lelinka lowered her eyes to the plate of oatmeal with milk and explained her discovery at the soap store. If only her father would talk to Don Tomas. But it was useless because he was also a Gachupin. Her father shook his head. "It is not about being a Gachupin. Don't get confused. Don Tomas loves that doll," he answered. Her father did not seem to understand anything. Didn't he realize he wasn't Mexican? End quote. Afterwards, her father offers to buy her another doll, just like that of Don Tomas. But Lelinka refuses, as she says Don Tomas's doll is unique. In this statement, Elena Garro shows that it's not really the doll Lelinka wants, but to be accepted by Don Tomás, because if she was indigenous, he would have let her have the door. Determined to reach this goal of acceptance, Lelinka and her sister Evita dropped by the soap store daily. The girls managed to impress Don Tomás by their admiration and respect for him and his culture. He notes that they do not come to trivialize or insult his cultural roots. Realizing the respect, he in return treats them with more acceptance, the very thing Lelinka craves. He then places a small stool where the girls could stand and admire the door, which they call a little goddess. However, Lelinka realizes that it's not enough to contemplate this other world from the silence. To be accepted by Don Tomás as one of his people, one must identify with them. She understands this clearly when her sister asks, quote, "What do you prefer, being a fly or being a queen?" End quote. Lelinka responds by saying she prefers to be a fly because these insects can fly and are able to get to places people can't. Elena Garro uses the power of magical realism taught to her by her indigenous extended family to have Lelinka imagine becoming a fly and touch the all-powerful door. When she lands on the door as a fly, her fantasy comes true, allowing her to become part of the indigenous mystical reality the doll represented. Lelinka reconciles her identity conflict thanks to the power of magical thinking. Within that space in the soap store with acceptance from Don Tomás, she synthesizes her Mexicaness as an adaptation to the cultural world of Gachupines and Mexicanos. Yet, by the end of the story, Don Tomás does not speak with a Mexican accent. With this image, Garro nullifies the racism and proposes a universal humanity where there is capacity for all languages spoken without accents of all cultures and of all people of any gender, race, or color. Nevertheless, Elena's life completely changed when she marries Octavio Paz at the age of 20 in 1937. Before marrying Octavio, Elena was in her second year of study in literature at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She had many artistic interests, including studying classical dance, theater, and cinematography. She was a choreographer at the University Theater, directed by Julio Bracho, and she worked with Rodolfo Sigli and Javier Villaurrutia. But after their marriage, Paz was completely controlling and overbearing, forcing her to leave her studies and intellectual interests, as well as forbidding her to return to the university or continue her studies in dance, theater, and writing. This was the beginning of her odyssey, her long, dark journey with Octavio Paz. In December 1939, the only child of their marriage, Elena Laura Paz Garro, was born in Mexico City. Following Octavio's career, the Paz Garro family lived in the United States, France, Japan, and Switzerland from 1943 to 1953. During this time, Elena's only sanctuary was writing in secret, her works consigned to hidden diaries, poems, plays, and even novels. In fact, between 1951 to 1953, while living in Paris, and then in Bern, Switzerland, Garro wrote her novel, Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, or Recollections of Things to Come, but without hope to publish it because of the power that Octavio Paz had over her. He was very jealous of Garro's talent, and he did not want his wife to overshadow his work as a writer. Elena continued being oppressed by Octavio when they returned to Mexico in 1953, but a new chapter of her life began at the end of 1956 Besides writing without publishing, she embarked on her journey of social activism for the indigenous people of Mexico, specifically those of Aguatepec in the state of Morelos. The people she fought for were campesinos or farmers who had little to nothing in their name, but had everything taken from them by the landowners, the corrupt politicians, and the banks. The very system that the revolutionary general Emiliano Zapata fought to overturn was still very much alive and still exploiting the indigenous population in rural Mexico. There had been no change. Elena, seeing this, decided to act, and in this way, she became her own version of General Emiliano Zapata, just as she imagined herself as a child. In July 1957, Elena Garro finally got the chance to spread her literary wings. This was only possible in the Patriarchal Society of Mexico with the approval of her husband, Octavio Paz, who supported staging 3 of her plays with the theater group Poesía en Voz Alta, Poetry Out Loud, of which Octavio led. With these 3 plays, Andarse por las Ramas, To Wander Through the Branches, Los Pilares de Doña Blanca, The Pillars of Doña Blanca, and Un Hogar Sólido, A Solid Home, Elena revolutionized Mexican stage play, writing, and subsequently Mexican theater. She was the first Mexican and Latin American playwright to introduce magical elements into a pragmatic-based play, or, in other words, our old friend magical realism. No other Latin American playwright had ever done anything like that before her, and she was a woman. But Garro did not approve the commercialization of the term magical realism for her work, because, according to her, she was only trying to reproduce in literature the worldview, or better said, the Mesoamerican cosmovision of the indigenous people of Mexico that had existed for many centuries. In 1958, the University of Veracruz published her first book, a collection of 6 plays, Un Hogar Sólido y otras piezas en un acto, or A Solid Home and other short plays. However, her intense social activism proved to be provocative to the traditional conservative elites of Mexico, and consequently, she found herself expelled from her country in February 1959. She established herself with her daughter in Paris. The marriage between Octavio and Elena ended in 1959, but they continued their relationship in one way or another. Elena returned to Mexico in June of 1963 and resumed her social political activism. 5 months after arriving in Mexico, in November 1963, her first novel, written 10 years earlier, was finally published, Recollections of Things to Come. This was only possible because Octavio Paz allowed the novel to be published, but only after a unique set of circumstances transpired. I don't have time to explain the details right now, but if someone asks me during questions, I will be more than happy to elaborate. Yet, Elena's Recollections of Things to Come was repressed by the Patriarchal Society, who did not include it as part of the international Latin American literary boom of the 60s. It is obviously one of the most innovative novels of its time, and still is, even by today's standards. During this period, Garro wrote short stories, plays, novels, and scripts, but she also dedicated herself to journalism about the exploitation of the indigenous and the corrupt Mexican government. In 1965, Elena became a strong supporter of Carlos Alberto Madrazo Becerra, one of Mexico's greatest advocates for democratic and land reform. Madrazo proposed to restructure the Mexican one-party system under the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, or the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, to allow real choice for the voter and better representation of the people through a multi-party system. Elena used her journalism to help spread the word of Madrazo and became a true revolutionary general, fighting for the implementation of promised land reform that gave property to the indigenous and poor people. By the middle of 1968, Garro and Madrazo were two of the main figures committed to the reform of Mexican politics. At the same time, a massive student movement, the Movimiento Estudiantil, had formed, protesting lack of freedom of speech, police oppression, as well as the tyranny of the PRI that had been in power since 1929. Thanks to historically accurate accounts and photographs, we now know how the social discontent throughout the country was quelled one infamous day, October 2nd, 1968. On this day, a massive demonstration of the student movement at the Tlatelolco Square was planned, and an estimated 8,000 people attended. In response, fearing losing control over the country, President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, along with some members of his cabinet, like Luis Echeverría Álvarez, his Secretary of State, ordered that the situation be contained. What transpired next was the infamous massacre of Tlatelolco. Tlatelolco is a public area in the shape of an open square with a church, an archaeological Mesoamerican site, and surrounded by apartment buildings. On October 2nd, 1968, the crowd had gathered for their demonstration, and it was peaceful, listening to the leaders speaking. It was a beautiful sunny day in fall in Mexico City. Among them were women, elders, and even children running and playing. The crowd was jubilant, hopeful that real change was coming. Then it was time to go home with the meeting ending. Suddenly, roaring engines could be heard. Helicopters flew in overhead and circled around like menacing birds of prey. Unbeknownst to the crowd, snipers had taken up positions on rooftops all around, while tanks and foot soldiers armed to the teeth encircled Tlatelolco, just outside of the square. Lights suddenly appeared from the sky and flares fell to the ground. The first shots rang out and all hell broke loose. Soldiers began to advance into the square. As panic overwhelmed the crowd, everyone ran in every direction trying to escape the random hail of bullets that rained down on them. The tanks rolled into the square. The dead littered the ground. To cover up their crimes, the Mexican government claimed there was no massacre, and instead they were stopping a coup d'etat organized by Carlos Madrazo and Elena Garro to install a communist government, which of course were lies. The Mexican government's official line was to blame everything on Madrazo and Garro. In this way, President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz was able to destroy two birds with one stone, that being his two main enemies, Madrazo and his political organization, and the student movement. The government, being perfectionist, 9 months after the massacre of Tlatelolco, assassinated Madrazo by literally blowing up the flight he and his wife were on with a bomb, killing at least 70 people. to absolutely ensure Madrazo would never be a threat to them again. Elena's fate was not much better. The Mexican government used the press to generate an immense amount of propaganda to slander her reputation, such as claiming that she gave the government the names of intellectuals involved in the student movement. Of course, all her colleagues and friends, including Octavio Paz, believed she had completely betrayed them, leaving her alone and ultimately defeated. This was the successful assassination of Elena Garro. Instead of killing her literally, it was through destroying her reputation. With the Mexican government's media campaign and overall success, they offered her only one path forward. The government's secret police made it known to her that if she didn't leave, they would kill her. Elena left Mexico and lived in exile, with increasing misery, hunger, and abysmal, paralyzing poverty. Her exile practically lasted the rest of her life. Only in 1991, after 20 years of living on the run in the United States, Spain, and France, Elena finally returned to Mexico. In 1993, she established herself in Cuernavaca with her daughter Elena and her beloved cat. Even though living in Mexico, she spent the final 5 years of her life in a small, dilapidated apartment, ostracized, and effectively still exiled. On August 22nd, 1998, Elena Garro died, and today, after all the slander against her, her work is finally being academically reviewed and appreciated by people, not only in Mexico, but also Europe and Latin America. Elena's legacy lives on in one of her most emblematic writings, Recollections of Things to Come, and we are celebrating its 60th anniversary today. Since it is a very complex novel, I will summarize it to the best of my ability, but I highly recommend all of you to read it, especially since it has been translated to English by Ruth L.C. Sims, like Olivia already mentioned, published by the University of Texas Press in 1969, which is currently available. Even my son has bought his own copy now, so I know it's available. Recollections of Things to Come is focused on the cruelty of the Guerra Cristera, or Cristero War, that took place from 1926 to 1929, when the new revolutionary government tried to eliminate the Catholic Church's domination over the governing body of Mexico. It is during this war that we enter the sleepy little village of Ixtepec. Elena Garro was 10 years old when the Cristero War occurred. Ixtepec in the novel is based on Elena's childhood home memories of Iguala. Therefore, Iguala becomes the mythical place of Ixtepec, which furthermore represents the rest of Mexico. Garro brings the conflict to life through her characters, but more than the historical conflict with the church, we learn how both the church and the government worked against the people to take their land. The dictator Plutarco Elías Calles, the president of Mexico from 1924 to 1928, and the power behind the presidency till 1936, was a self-serving racist who imposed his ruling class over others, especially the indigenous people and women. In an interview with Joseph Somers, 1965, 2 years after Recollections of Things to Come was finally published, Garro explained how the Catholic Church, the Archbishop of Mexico, the Porfiristas, or the followers of the dictator Porfirio Díaz, defeated by the Mexican Revolution, and some of the ambitious generals from the revolution, all of them created an alliance to trigger a religious conflict among the Mexican people, so they could kill them with justification and rob the land from their dead victims for themselves. Recollections of Things to Come begins with Istepec itself narrating the scene. It tells us it sits on something like a stone. Quote, aquí estoy, sentado sobre esta piedra aparente. Here I sit on what looks like a stone, end quote. This is an element of magical realism that Elena Garro constructed to provide an overview and help us understand the plot of the novel. Then Istepec tells us it is filled with memories. Quote, yo solo soy memoria y la memoria que de mí se tenga. I am only memory and the memory that one has of me, end quote. It also narrates that itself was once a peaceful little idyllic village with people living their lives. But with a constant reminder of the failure of the Mexican Revolution, betrayed by some of their leaders who took power for themselves. Through flashbacks, Ixtepec introduces the main characters, Isabel, Nicolás, and Juan Moncada, Julia Andrade, and Felipe Hurtado, as well as the antagonist of the novel, General Francisco Rosas, who fought in the Mexican Revolution for freedom and ideals, but in the end had become a tyrant. Julia Andrade is a beautiful woman who has been kidnapped by General Rosas. Felipe, her lover, comes searching for her. He is an imaginative poet who loves the theater and uses it to help others to escape their oppressed lives. Therefore, he convinces the Moncada family and their friends to stage a play. But before they are able to stage it, Felipe is discovered by General Rosas and is cornered in his friend's house. Ordered to surrender himself as Felipe walks out into the street to yield to Rosas' soldiers, time stops. Everyone and everything in the town was completely frozen. We are then told that a mule driver was approaching the town as morning dawned, but he noticed that Ixtepec was still enveloped in darkness, stuck in time. Suddenly, the mule driver sees a man on horseback with a woman in pink in his arms riding towards him. It was Felipe and Julia. They had magically escaped from their certain death. At this point, the first part of the novel ends. Through this event, Garro tells us how the indigenous people of old Mexico interpret time. For them, every 52 years was the end of a cycle of time and the beginning of a new one. In the novel, Elena refers to this with the freezing of time, at which the current cycle of Felipe and Julia ends and a new one starts. In the second part of the novel, Ixtepec, Elena Garro's alter ego, never explains what happened to Felipe and Julia. Here, Garro provides two interpretations to the reader. On the one hand, she presents the logical scenario that most Western readers would conclude that General Rosas kills Julia and Felipe. On the other hand, she also provides an alternative ending where both escape with the use of magical realism of the Mesoamerican cosmovision or world view. From these two interpretations, the second one prevails with the sentient village, Ixtepec, and the town's people. They truly still believed that Felipe and Julia lived on to be able to cope with their deaths, because they are major symbols in Elena's novel, representing love, innocence, creativity, hope, and goodness. When they are gone from the village, regardless of how, their absence signifies the end of an era for the village and the beginning of another one. That's why in the second part of the novel, we see both Ixtepec and the people of the town depressed after losing two of the most beautiful people the town had ever seen. They had lost the creative and infectious joy of Felipe, while Julia had brought kindness and compassion. In contrast, General Rosas becomes infuriated, realizing with the loss of Julia, she had never loved him. In his rage, he became even more of a tyrant than before. This personal event of his life takes place at the same time the Cristero War begins. And not to neglect his duties, Rosas' mission in Ixtepec is to shut down the Catholic Church in the town and to stop the priest at all costs, including by death. When the people of Ixtepec find out that General Rosas is hunting their priest, they decide to band together and save him. The families of the town, including the Moncadas, plan to help the priest by inviting General Rosas and all his generals to a party to distract them, while Nicolás and Juan Moncada help smuggle the priest out of town. But the Moncadas don't care at all about saving the life of the priest. In fact, Isabel criticizes him for blessing the lands taken away from the indigenous owners by General Rosas' mercenaries. The Moncada used this plan as a pretext to try to escape from the tyranny of Francisco Rosas in search of a different life. Nevertheless, all their preparations were for naught, as Rosas was suspicious and sent one of his soldiers to spy on the townspeople and found out the plan, including the route the priest would take to escape. Rosas and his faithful officers attend the party, knowing full well the plan, and play along with the townspeople who are trying to charm them. As the night comes to an end, Rosas orders more music and dancing, and the people are not allowed to leave for the night. Instead of being the hunters, the townspeople become the hunted. Yet, one person does not feel threatened, that being Isabel Moncada, who throughout the night falls in love with General Rosas. Meanwhile, unknowingly to the townspeople, as Nicolás, Juan, and the priest attempt to escape the town, Rosas soldiers ambush them, killing Juan among other compatriots and capturing the rest, including Nicolás. The party ends, and General Rosas invites Isabel to become his lover in place of Julia, to humiliate the townspeople and demonstrate to them who is in control of everything. Isabel goes with Francisco Rosas to the hotel he has taken over. She discovers that Juan was killed and Nicolás has been captured by Rosas soldiers, and their plot has failed. Isabel asks Rosas to spare her brother's life, to which he agrees. As Nicolás, the priest, and the rest of the prisoners are taken to the local graveyard to be executed, the soldiers shoot everyone but Nicolás. He realizes he has been spared by the help of his sister, infuriating him, and he demands the soldiers to honorably kill him as well, to which they oblige. General Rosas, who had signed up for the Mexican Revolution, has become the very tyrannical monster he set out to stop years ago. He has also lost his soul and his destiny and left the village forever. Isabel is then abandoned with her brother's death. Gregoria, a village elder, indigenous woman, takes Isabel to a church sanctuary on top of the hill in town, so Isabel can be cured by removing her love for General Rosas. However, she refuses, exclaiming, quote, "Aunque Dios me condene, quiero ver a Francisco Rosas otra vez. Even though God condemns me, I still want to see Francisco Rosas one more time," end quote. And Isabel runs down the hill, but before she can reach the bottom, she is transformed into a sinful stone. Gregoria pushes the stone back up the hill to the sanctuary for the Virgin and God to save her soul. Through Gregoria, Garro illustrates how the indigenous of Mexico embrace both worldviews, the Western civilization and magical realism. Gregoria refers to Julia as la difunta, which means somebody that is dead, because Rosas had killed her, and does not believe that she had escaped magically. But at the same time, Gregoria also believes that Isabel had magically turned to stone. One of the most important themes that Elena Garro addresses in the novel is the female condition in the Mexican patriarchal society. This is represented mainly by Julia and Isabel and how they are treated. Julia is a kidnapped sex slave for General Rosas and only can escape through an act of literal magic or death. This represents how women in Mexico are just seen as sex objects. Isabel, on the other hand, rejects marriage earlier in the novel after her mother pressured her to do so. She responds to her by saying, quote, "No me voy a casar, I am not getting married," end quote. Isabel feels humiliated that for women, marriage is the only option. Then she renounces traditional Mexican roles for women by falling in love with the outcast of Ixtepec, General Rosas, which ironically is the same man who was sexually oppressing Julia. At one point in the novel, General Rosas even cries out, quote, "Todas las mujeres son unas putas, all women are whores," end quote. These women characters, along with others in the novel I did not talk about, represent the female oppression in Mexico by the patriarchal society that views women as inferior and subhuman, something that Elena Garro also experienced far too much in her life. Elena also introduces the different concepts of time. On the one hand, we have seen the use of the pre-Hispanic concept of time in part 1 with Julia and Felipe, whereas mentioned before, according to the indigenous of Mexico, every 52 years, a cycle of time ends and a new era begins. Garro also uses the cyclical concept of time in the structure of her novel. It begins with Isabel already turned to stone and with the sentience of Ixtepec sitting on top of her. And the novel ends with Isabel running from the sanctuary in the name of her love for Rosas, causing her to turn into said rock. The village elder Gregoria rolls her back up to the sanctuary where Ixtepec sits on her, where the novel begins. But the title of the novel itself is also cyclical. Recollections of Things to Come does not mean to have memories of the future, but that the future has already happened. Everything that is happening has already happened before. Elena is referring to the state of Mexico, that before the so-called revolution, the tyrannical government of Porfirio Diaz killed the indigenous and peasants without repercussions and took their land. After the revolution, the Mexican generals that once fought for the people now, you guess it, killed them to take their land. This is represented by General Francisco Rosas in the novel, as he became a general through the revolution. And after it, he killed the very same people he fought to protect. Before and after the Mexican Revolution, nothing has changed. This is also how Elena Garro uses the fictional village of Ixtepec as a symbol to represent all of Mexico. Rosas comes in and kills anyone who defies him in Ixtepec, and defies him in Ixtepec on orders of the government, which has repeated all throughout Mexico since the Spanish conquest. Not only that, but Elena claims that all progress that was supposed to happen to reform Mexico is an illusion. created by the corrupt elite of Mexico, comprised of the rich, the landowners, and now the generals, to pacify the common people long enough to put into place a plan to rob them once again. Finally, Elena Garro demonstrates that Mexico is in stasis, represented by Isabel turning to stone, which is a reference to Mesoamerican myths of women being petrified for not following the rules of their society. Isabel refuses to acknowledge her mistakes and instead guards her transgression. In turn, Isabel is shape-shifted to rock and cannot change. She represents how the rest of Mexico is unable to make any real progress throughout the rest of the country. There has been no land reform and no protection for the people. The government body is petrified, as none of those in power want any reform and instead decide to keep all the authority in their hands to preserve the oligarchs. The struggle of people standing up for themselves in Mexico is timeless, from the revolution to the massacre of Tlatelolco to today. As they were killed by the rich and powerful before, people are now, today, are being killed by the cartels, police, and the army of Mexico. Thus, Elena's novel has proven to be eternal, criticizing flaws in Mexico that are still true today. The recollection of things to come is real, since to know the future, all we need to do is understand our past. Like the philosopher George Santayana, who was born in Spain and raised in the United States, once said, quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it," end quote. These are some of the reasons why Elena Garro's Recollections of Things to Come is one of the most provocative and true revolutionary novels written in the past century. And that's why I invite all of you to read it. Thank you so much. And if we have time, I can show some images of Elena Garro, photos.
Yes, Patty, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Can you see the images?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, so here we have some images of photos of Elena Garro with her family and some friends.
Sorry, Patty, can you change to screen mode?
Oh,
Remember?
yes, I'm sorry.
Like,
yes. Here?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. So here we have Elena in 1919, when she was around 3 to 4 years old. Here, this is Elena. Can you see the arrow in the screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, this is Elena, her father, Jose Antonio, and her older sister, Deva. They are, at this time, they were in Mexico City. Here is Esperanza Navarro. This is Elena. I'm sorry, Esperanza is holding her daughter Estrella. This is Deva. Here again, we have the girls with their parents, Esperanza, Jose Antonio, Estrella, Deva, Elena. Elena always very close to her father. Elena in 1934, when she was attending junior high, before high school. Here is, they are in the lake in Chapultepec Lake in 1936, when Octavio Paz and Elena Garro were dating. Elena was at that moment studying at the university, in La UNAM, studying literature. And this is Deva, her sister, and other friends. And here are Elena in 1936 dating. When they got married in May 1937, Elena Garro and Octavio Paz went to Spain to to support the Republic. And in this image, they are walking on one of the streets in Valencia. They returned to Mexico, and in this image, we see them in 1938. They are in Morelia, in Mexico, with a group of friends, Elena and Octavio. Here is Elena with her daughter, Elena Garro, and with her nephew, Francisco. In this image, we can see Deva with her son, Francisco, Elena with her daughter, Elena. And these are friends from Guerrero, from Iguala. They were always, through their whole life, they were very attached to Guerrero, no, to Iguala. And here are images of Elena Garro in Paris when they lived there in the late 40s. They lived in an apartment in the street of Victor Hugo. And here is Elena in the balcony of the apartment. Other images of Paris, Elena in Paris. Elena in Paris. Here she is in the French Riviera in 1947 with her daughter Elena. Paris, 1949. In some images, Elena is content, is happy. In others, she's sad, she's depressed. In this one, she's in Nice, with Picasso and other friends. They live in Japan for 4 months in 1952, and here they are on the street of Tokyo. In Tokyo, Octavio, Elena, and their daughter. This image is in New York in 1957. Elena is with the Argentinian writer Adolfo V. Casares. Here is Octavio and their daughter Elena. In this image, Elena is with the French film director Marcel Camus in Mexico City. They plan to make a movie based on one of Elena's scripts, but unfortunately didn't come true. And here Elena loved theater since she was a child, and here she's playing, acting with Carlos Fuentes and Rita Macedo. At that time, they were married, and they are in Rita Macedo and Carlos Fuentes' house. In these images, Elena is in her home in Las Lomas in Mexico in 1966 with one of her cats. I'm sorry. And here this photo was taken after the massacre of Tlatelolco, when the exile starts for Elena. And this is in 1971. She was still in Mexico City, running, from one place to another, when finally, in 1970, she managed to rent an apartment. And then in 1972 is when she left Mexico and went to New York. She asked for political exile in New York. They rejected, and so here is in New York, and here is in Spain in 1979 with the Spanish writer, poet, José Bergamín. By the late 70s, Elena was doing much better thanks to the support that she received from Tierno Galván, the mayor of Madrid at that time. And here is 1991 when Elena returned to Mexico. She's in Puebla, and Elena here signing a book. Here is when we went to see her in 1997, 1998. This is my son Emiliano playing with Federico, one of Elena's cats. And these are the covers of the first editions. This is Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, the cover of the first edition, 1963, and the cover of the first edition of the translation in English, Recollection of Things to Come, from 1969. And this is Elena, 1916-1998. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patty, for an extraordinary presentation that does indeed bring us closer to such a complex and important writer as Elena Garro. And well, we would now like to open the floor for questions. You may address your questions to UNAM-UK in that option, or you may raise your hand, turn on your camera, and do them directly. Questions are welcome both in English and in Spanish. We are trying to make Elena Garro better known in the English-speaking world, but anyone is welcome to make their questions in Spanish. Okay. Muriel says, thank you for putting together such an amazing event. Thank you. It is always a delight to hear about Elena Garro. Recollections of Things to Come is a true gem that showcases her remarkable talent and deserves more recognition. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Gracias. Thank you very much from Maria Jose. Hefsiba also says thank you. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Maybe I can ask a question. You spoke a little bit, Patricia, about the things that inspired her, what she had in her youth, the books that were read at home, the stories that were told, as well as the myths of the indigenous people of Mexico. But is there a literary influence that is important in Elena Garro's writing? Is there a writer that she admired, man or woman?
She pretty much always talked about the classic Spanish writers, you know, like Cervantes, Lope de Vega, Calderón de la Barca, especially Cervantes. You know, when the reporters used to ask her, you know, what are your influences? I mean, what are your main writers? Which ones do you admire best? You are so innovative, you know, you bring together so many different things in your short stories, in your novels. And she will also say, well, I don't know what are you so surprised about that? You know, the Spaniards where they use magical realism too, you know, and she will always talk about these writers, especially Cervantes, you know, las novelas ejemplares, and el coloquio de los perros, you know, how do we translate that into English? I don't know, Olivia can help us. El coloquio de los perros, like the dialogue between dogs, you know, kind of thing, the two dogs that talk. So for Elena, what was she doing? It was not really nothing, new, you know. And she also always talked about the poets, the writers, the philosophers of the Romantic movement from Germany. She admired very much the German writers and the Russian writers. She will talk many times in an extended way about Dostoevsky. She admired very much Dostoevsky. So I can say that, you know, and of course the Greeks. I mean, she was always making references to Homer, you know, the Iliad. That was very important for her during her childhood. So she was a very well-educated person, you know, since she was little. That's why I get, you know, I have to say this over and over. because a lot of people think that Elena Garro was not that well educated when she met Octavio Paz, and that she became very knowledgeable when she met Octavio Paz, and that is not true. I mean, Elena Garro was already very well educated through her family, especially through her father and mother. No, but she will say that her mother was always reading, and she didn't care. I mean, about the household, the kids running, whatever they wanted to do. But her father was like the teacher. You know, the father was the one that after work he will come home and ask them, what did you read? Explain to me, what did you learn today? You know, so her father and her uncle Bonnie were like the main sources for them of, you know, to get all these very important education, the Western education. And then the nannies were raising them too. So that's why it's so important, these both views, you know, in Elena Garro's work, because we can see that. We can see that in all her work.
Thank you very much. And I would like to ask Olivia about the innovative aspect, because you know contemporary Mexican literature very well, Olivia, and you mentioned that Recollections of Things to Come still has an edge to it. It still preserves an innovative aspect that stands up today. Can you elaborate a little bit more upon that, please?
I tried to mention a few of these things in the presentation. So I think, you know, that emphasis on not having a person, a character as a narrator, and making us see things from a perspective that is not a dominant human perspective, but just coming up with this wonderful idea of the town itself narrating. I mean, that is certainly one thing that to me seems innovative even now. That would be, and also the fact of just the lyrical, bringing in the lyrical style into this narrative that is at the same time so politically potent. I don't know if that's innovative, but definitely I think that the novel still pushes us or invites us to imagine and to conceptualize things in ways that are non-traditional. We don't tend to think about, you know, a town narrating things and a town being made of chicadas, but at the same time generals, and obviously towns are made of all these things, and is the way in which she plays with scales. So the different things that I mentioned really in the presentation are things that come to mind right now. And in a lot of Latin American literature being written in this century, in the 21st century, this concern for our interaction between the human and the non-human and the environmental and the what we would call the natural world is very much a contemporary concern. And this idea of literature asking these questions about how we relate to other humans, but also to other entities, I think is definitely something of our time.
And well, this is a question for both of you. Do you believe that things have essentially changed for women in Latin American literature, in particular in Mexican literature? Has there been a true change?
I think a lot more women writers are being recognized now than, you know, I think it is definitely in relative terms to be a writer now is probably much easier than to have been a writer when Elena Garro was being a writer. So I think in that sense, definitely, but I think we still have, for example, literary prizes where the jury are all men, or where giving a prize for a woman seems to be still an extraordinary type of event. So I think there's been progress. Oh, there's also an expectation that women are going to be writing about certain themes or topics. So I think there has been progress, but I don't think we can talk about complete equality. But I don't know what Patricia thinks.
Yeah, no, I agree 100% with you, Olivia. Definitely, there has been some changes. Now we see more women, I mean, from all generations, writing and publishing and very, very active, you know. But the real change hasn't really happened yet, no? I mean, we can see what is going on in Mexico, where they say around 15 to 20 women are being killed every day in Mexico. So how can we say there is a change, you know, a real change? No way. So the patriarchal society is still very much in power. And like Olivia mentioned, you know, most of the awards or the you know, the recognitions are pretty much still, you know, are still being won by the men. And like this comes to my mind that when Elena Garro published Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, she won the Javier Villaurrutia National Prize. But she had to share it with Juan José Arreola for his novel La Feria, you know? So to me, it was like, they couldn't give the whole prize, the whole recognition only to Elena, you know? A man has to be besides her too. So, and this is still going on, you know, this is still going on. So I think Elena, I mean, Recollection of Things to Come is still very, very, it's a novel that we can read and we can identify with the, for example, the female characters, you know, that are oppressed. We can identify with them, definitely. And I think the new generations too.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to read some of the comments in the chat box. Joel Alonso Luna Mendoza says, Elena is such an amazing writer. I'm glad that she's finally being recognized more. She deserves to be known, to be read and understood. Isabel López, muchas gracias Patricia, Olivia. Gran y profundo acercamiento a los recuerdos del porvenir y a la vida de nuestra gran escritora Elena Garro, incluyendo las fotografías. Joel Alonso Luna dice, when we talk about recuerdos del porvenir, for me, it is rather interesting to talk about the prostitutes. What would be their role in the story? Thinking on perhaps more symbolic or deeper meaning. Would you like to elaborate?
I could say one thing and then Patricia can obviously give her view. One thing that I find really interesting about the prostitutes in the story is how they act as a collective group of women. In a way, we see this idea of sisterhood, even though they are in an environment that by definition exploits them and, you know, you uses their body as a commodity and so on. They are presented, they have certain agency and they are a collective group of people. So I think these are important things to notice. I don't know if not necessarily a symbolic meaning, but simply, you know, that power of the collective, of a collective of women who can impact. They try and fail, but they try to, you know, influence the political developments of what is happening. And one thing that still strikes me of the novel now is how strong the female characters are. I mean, everyone fails in some way in Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, but definitely the weight of many of the decisions are on the female characters and in a multiplicity of them. The other thing is that female characters are not all portrayed under just one brush, but characters are individuals, which is also interesting. But yeah, I don't know what you think, Patricia.
Yeah, no, definitely, I agree. I agree, Olivia. You know, I think that all the female characters in the novel are oppressed in one way or another. You know, the prostitutes, the the generals, lovers, you know, all these women that are there. Some of them are there because they decided, you know, to go with these generals and live with them, but others were kidnapped by these powerful men, you know, like Julia was for Rosas, but there were other ones that were there against their will. But the generals had all the power, you know, to keep them there. So the women are oppressed by the generals, by, you know, the prostitutes, you know, by the patriarchal society, all the women, you know, from the families like Las Moncada, Isabel Moncada or Conchita, you know, the other girl that is also very much oppressed, you know, all of them, all the women. And like Olivia said, none of them could really make a change, you know, could break with this very oppressive life that they have around all these men. Even Isabel's mother, you know, she says, I wish you could get married. She says to Isabel, even though her mother is very liberal and very progressive and reads a lot, but she doesn't see any other choice for her daughter. She just wants her daughter to be safe. And she thinks that being safe for her, for Isabel, is to get married, you know, be protected by a man. So it's just so difficult to really break and escape this condition that we have for women, you know, in the society. Yes.
Yes, I mean, I entirely agree, but I think one thing that is important in the novel is that Elena Garro shows how these different female characters are oppressed in different ways, because she brings in issues of social class and ethnicity, and she shows that there isn't, you know, one form of oppression, but that actually things are much more complex than that, and that there are certain, for example, like indigenous characters are going to be also object of discrimination on account of economic equality and also racial discrimination. So she's very attentive to all these things, and is never a broad brush saying, oh, all women are oppressed, but actually showing very carefully how other circumstances contribute to these different types of oppression.
Exactly. Yes, definitely. So Elena is really amazing, no? The way she, like you said, Olivia, the way she brings together everything, no? She waves everything. Is just very interesting. And anyway, but go ahead, Ana Elena.
Very well. Joel Alonso says, gracias, uno de mis personajes más queridos es la Taconcitos. Un poco de lo que estamos hablando. Ajá. Por eso es la pregunta, les agradezco mucho. Ok, gracias, Joel Alonso. Rubén Alcántara, is it true that Octavio Paz forced Elena Garro to stop writing? Would she have been more prolific if this had not been the case? Thank you.
Yes, yeah, he definitely prevented Elena to write and publish, you know, especially after they got married. And during the 40s and 50s, Elena always wrote. I mean, and we can see that in her diaries and in correspondence, you know, in letters that she was writing, that she was hiding. I'm sorry, she was hiding. She had to hide everything she was writing because Octavio Paz will get very mad. And I mean, it was just, you know, he was very egocentric and he just wanted to be the only one in the family to be writing and to be publishing and to be there, you know. So yeah, definitely. And Elena says that in her diaries. She says that many times she had to destroy her writings or burn them or, you know, hide them because Octavio, she said, in order to live in peace, you know, para tener la vida en paz, you know, playing with the words, I had to do that. And Octavio Paz, even even when Elena went back to Mexico in 1993, they interviewed her in 1996, I believe, and Octavio Paz had to interrupt the interview that was being, on TV, alive on TV, and he was saying that Elena was lying, that everything she was saying was lies, and that is in the books, Monse. In Diálogos con Elena Garro, I reproduced that anecdote in the second volume, where it was a big scandal, because it was public. The audience knew this. I mean, Octavio Paz was interrupting the transmission of the interview with Elena Garro, and he was even 3 years before they died, he was still, saying, I am in control of everything. Elena lies. Elena is not true that she, met Picasso, or that she knew Breton, or that she was a very well-known writer. I mean, he was always, being very egocentric.
Yes. We have 1 minute left and several comments. Maybe this will be left as a bit of a homework for us. By the way, Olivia apologizes because she really had to leave. But I'm going to read the questions in the chat box. So Lauren Hatzinger says, do you think the name Los Recuerdos del Porvenir is related to Alejo Carpentier's Los Pasos Perdidos? There is a cafe at the end of the Los Pasos Perdidos that shares the same name. And I read a publication that suggested Garro was influenced by Carpentier's novel. Thank you.
I would like to answer that very quickly, if it is possible, Ana Elena, because there is a lot of misunderstanding. It's the other way around. Carpentier took the name of Los Recuerdos del Porvenir from Elena Garro. Let me tell you very quickly. Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, where the title comes from. When Elena Garro was, in 1936, when she was dating Octavio Paz, Elena Garro belonged to this group of intellectuals, students that used to go to a pulqueria. And I don't know how to translate that, Ana Elena. Pulqueria. Pulqueria is a place where they drink pulque. Yeah.
A pulque bar.
Pulque bar, a beverage made out of agave, no? And so there was this pulqueria called Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, but the origin of this pulqueria was that the owner had this pulqueria and the name was Los Recuerdos. Okay, perdón, it was El Porvenir. The pulqueria's name was El Porvenir. But he has to close down the place, and it was demolished, and he reopened the pulqueria in another location, and he called the pulqueria Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, no? So Elena used to go to that pulqueria in 1936, with Octavio Paz, with Isabella Corona, with Julio Bracho, all the intellectuals, the snobs, used to go to that pulqueria. So Elena took the name of la pulqueria and used it in her novel. So Carpentier did that after Elena. I mean, he knew of the place through Elena, through that group. But what happened is that because Elena always was publishing so late, everybody thinks that Elena, is the one that is being influenced by others, and it's the other way around. But Elena was also very, very humble. She never was like, oh, I am the one, the first one that did this. I am the first one that did that. Elena didn't really care about that,
Thank you very much. I'm afraid time is up, but we are going to copy all the questions that are in the chat box and forward them to you. Thank you to everybody who has been here with us and who has been following the talks on Facebook. Monse, would you like to say goodbye on behalf of the libraries?
Yeah, thank you very much to all for coming and making this event so wonderful and interesting. Thank you, especially to Patricia and Olivia, and to you, and Elena, and to Angelica. Thank you so much. And let's hope that this is just the first of a lot of events about women writers, Latino American women writers.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We look very much forward to another collaboration in the not too distant future.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Likewise.
You will be able to watch the talk afterwards, both in Facebook and on YouTube. Thank you. Have a nice evening. Have a nice Friday.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.